Well, it's time now for perspective. Russian President Vladimir Putin's past as an officer for the KGB is well documented. But how exactly did Putin's time in the Soviet secret police go on to inform the strongman we know today? And what of Putin's immensely wealthy and immensely powerful inner circle? My guest today is Reuters journalist Catherine Belton, who's this year published Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and then took on the West. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us today on France 24. My first question, who exactly are Putin's people?
Putin's people are his inner circle of close comrades. Most of them served with him in the KGB. He knows many of them from the Leningrad era when he was starting out in the late 70s. Perhaps the closest to him was Nikolai Patrushev, who is the very powerful head of the Russian Security Council and was the head of the Federal Security Services under the first two terms of Putin's presidency. And these are people who unfortunately have been steeped in a Cold War mindset. They see the world in terms of zero-sum games, and they want to get even with the West. And they've done so in a way under Putin's presidency in which they've managed to grab control of most of the country's strategic cash flows. And rather than just using all this cash to line their own pockets, they've also been creating strategic slush funds, which they use to shore up their own power at home and also to undermine their enemies in the West. They try to use these black cash flows to undermine and buy off and corrupt politicians in the West to try and unravel Western liberal democracies.
So you mentioned just there a Cold War mindset that binds Putin and his allies. What exactly do you mean there, and what are the ways in which we can see that operating today in Russia?
I guess, yes, it's an unfortunate remnant of that era. I mean, Putin kind of formed his mindset in the late 80s when he was working in Dresden in the KGB. He was stationed in East Germany. And we know from a defector and a former associate of his that he was involved then in active measures against the West. These were efforts to undermine and destabilize what they saw as the main adversary and who they continue to see as the main adversary, the United States and sort of other Western democracies. And so Putin then was involved in, he was a handler of a neo-Nazi who kind of was helping destabilize the West and then moved back to the East after the fall of the wall, where he really helped stoke the rise of the far right there. He was also, according to one associate, meeting with members of the Red Army faction of far-left terror group, and he was also sort of seeking to acquire poisonous materials and so on. And these were all efforts that were kind of steeped in covert actions. He was also involved, he and his comrades were also involved in technology smuggling, and they were using intermediaries and offshore companies in Liechtenstein and Singapore and places like that to move money and funnel Western technology into the East without being traced by the West. So he's really master of covert actions. And this is kind of something that we've tended to forget along the way since the collapse of the Cold War, just how skilled they are in these type of actions.
And what, if anything, in your opinion, was it about Vladimir Putin specifically that let him carve such an extraordinary path to power? What was special about Putin that perhaps his comrades didn't have at the time?
I think, well, of course, he was, at the time when he was climbing to power in the late 90s, of course, he was young. He'd managed to kind of achieve quite a stature in the Yeltsin administration because he was so efficient. He was a very good bureaucrat, but he was also good at being a chameleon. He was very good at blending into the background, and he managed to convince the Yeltsin family that he was one of of them. He paid lip service to democratic ideals. He was very charming. They thought he was young and progressive. And he also demonstrated his loyalty to the Yeltsin family at a time when they were under attack. They were under fire from a Russian prosecutor who was investigating them for their use of credit cards and that had been given to them by a Swiss firm which had won a multi-billion-dollar Kremlin reconstruction contract. So this was a big corruption case at the time, and Putin really used KGB methods to demonstrate his loyalty. He helped publish a tape of compromising material against the prosecutor, and really helped shield the Yeltsin family from attack. But really, all the while, he was playing a double game, because he was actually friends and a close associate and in contact with the whistleblower who helped dig up information on these credit cards in the first place. And he was also in contact with a former spy master, Yevgeny Primakov, who was the main rival to the Yeltsin family then. So he was always a tricky character, but essentially his main quality that helped him spring to power was his ability to really be a chameleon and convince the Yeltsin family of his liberal and progressive credentials at the same time as continuing to operate on the other side.
A fair number of reviews of your book describe your reporting here as fearless. Have you, during the course of your reporting over recent years, ever felt afraid of the Russian state machinery, of what they might feel about your work?
I think, I was quite lucky. I was writing it when I was. I began it before the kind of the conflict over Ukraine, before the annexation of Crimea. So I was researching it for a long time. But I left Russia in 2014 after the MH17 was down, but continued to be able to meet with my contacts and my sources. Many of them would travel into London, where they felt much more comfortable talking with me than they would have done in Russia, where they felt that they were perhaps under surveillance and that they couldn't speak quite so freely. So, I was in quite a safe position. I was in London. I wasn't in Moscow, unlike many of my sources. So, and it was also, while I was researching it, it was a period when Russia was kind of tearing up the rule book. It had just annexed Crimea. It was being sanctioned by the West, and it's perhaps less sensitive to how it might be perceived in the West than it might have been a few years before, because already in its actions in annexing Crimea, it had already gone beyond the pale, and they were less worried about what the West might think of them. So in a word, no, but of course there are various threats, including legal ones, along the way.
And lastly, I'm sorry, we don't have a huge amount of time left. How, in your opinion, does the Vladimir Putin story end? Will he still be clinging to power 10 years from now? And I do apologise, we only have about 30 seconds left.
I think he does want to step down. He's pretty tired by now, but his inner circle can't allow him to, because they've kind of committed so many nefarious acts on the road to accumulating so much power. It's too risky for them to allow him to step down. But I think if you look at how he acts nowadays, he looks pretty tired, and 20 years in that role is a long time.
Catherine Belton, author of Putin's People, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here on France 24 today.